So this was actually many, many years ago when web components were first starting, many web years ago. Dion Almer from Google basically stated, he says, I've built all these things in all these different languages, and I want to be able to take this thing I did in this language and carry it over to this one. The problem is, you can't. So before I get into this, I actually have a question for everybody. I wanted to try and figure out which frameworks everybody's using. Who is using Ember? Good. Who is using Vue? Okay, a few views. Okay, the obvious one, who's using React? Okay. Angular or AngularJS? Anything else? Backbone? Aurelia, okay. Unfortunately, I did not write for that one. So as stated, I've been writing code for almost 40 years. I started when I was 15 writing code to run the equipment for an undersea robotic welding system. And I actually got to go to Scotland for about 3 months to finish up the code. I have worked for a lot of companies, but the bigger companies you probably know, Broderbund, Intel, Family Search, and I am currently at IMAT Solutions, or also known as Perfect Search. We do medical documentation analysis. I love giving conference talks. At Family Search, they have their own thing called SORT, and I've given several talks there. And I love teaching people how to code. Okay, from this class, this is a how to use components, web components everywhere class. It's not really how to write a component, but if you would like to learn that, contact me. My information is going to be at the last slide, and so you can contact me and I can share you a lot of very good stuff on that. I promise not to lie to you at all, and I will admit being an expert for every framework ever written. Okay, fine, take off number 2. My examples are not written in best practices. I was at a talk earlier today where somebody said we should always write our examples in the best practices, and I felt guilty, so I figured I'd warn you. But I will present enough to get you thinking and to get you started on the idea of being able to write something that's carryover between anything. And I will answer questions at the end, and the code and slides will be available. They're not online yet, but they will be, and I'll give you my GitHub repo at the end. I will not pretend to love all frameworks. In fact, I dislike almost all of them. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. My preference, native web components and raw JavaScript. Thank you. I'll pay you later. And the reason for this is, if you remember back when jQuery first came out, everybody got on it and it was great. I mean, I admit, when I first saw jQuery, I thought this is one of the best things in the world because I don't have to worry about the browser inconsistencies anymore. Well, most of that's gone, right? Almost everything cool that jQuery brought to us is in the browser now, natively. Almost everything cool that underscore Lodash brought to us is in the browser natively. And so I just prefer writing native code. Now, I do use nope, wrong one. I do use ES6 imports, and I have code that allows me, basically I just transpile it down to give me require versions. And then I use require.js on the older browsers and import on the newer browsers, so I don't package anything. I don't use Webpack, I don't need to, because I just use import, and import allows me to go ahead and just deal with individual files. It gets rid of the redundancy. It doesn't do tree shaking, but I don't care because all of my files are so small. Most of my imported files or included files are between 2 and 12 lines. And that's it. But the nice thing is that code is only ever loaded once. So a brief history on web components. Modern web components is what we've got now. Were introduced in 2003 by Google. But prior to that, IE had TX, I can't remember what it's called anymore. I actually wrote in them, they were really cool. Firefox had their own version of something, which was actually also pretty cool, but both of them have been completely abandoned. And then in 2016, Google added V0 into Chrome. I want to think it's the year later they added version 1, V1, and almost all browsers now support it. Firefox is really, really close to being there, and now it's just a matter of Edge. Who cares about Edge? Oh, sorry. Okay, we got 2 people that care about Edge. So I'm sorry, but the nice thing is there are polyfills, and so you can still use your native web components there. Who here has actually written, not a Polymer, not an Angular, not a React, but a true native web component? Okay, about a dozen of you. Okay, so this is a common thing you're going to see as the parts of a web component. Custom elements, shadow DOM, HTML templates, and HTML import. HTML import is dead. It still exists in some of the browsers, but basically Safari and I believe it was Firefox said, no way, we're not doing that. ES6 imports is coming. Why would we do another way to import when that's already coming? So that was tossed out. You don't need HTML templates. They're cool, they have their purposes, but you don't need them. You don't need Shadow DOM. Now, Shadow DOM is probably one of the coolest things about web components that you can use, but the polyfills are atrocious. Now, if you're using something like Polymer or the new Stencil.js, they do some cool stuff that gets it to where it works really well. I don't care, I don't use it. Unless I'm on a browser that guarantees support of Shadow DOM. If I want something that's cross-browser compatible, I just don't use it. Yeah, there's some limits to it, but it's okay. Okay, so component example. Oops. Okay, so I've got, in my presentation here, I've got 2 very simple components. This first one, it just has 2 labels, 2 input fields. Is that big enough for everybody, by the way? A little bigger? So 2 input fields, and then down below, I just have this ID that I display because I wanted to guarantee that the framework wasn't causing a new instance of this thing to be regenerated every time it refreshed. Luckily, they're not. And so the way you define a web component is you create a class, call it what you want, and extend HTML element. If you want to extend other elements, that's now available in Chrome and soon to be available in most of the other browsers. It's polyfilled, so you'll be able to do it. In this particular case, I just look for the attributes name and age. When those things change, I get alerted to it. One of the most important things with web components, and anybody who's written them has probably been bit by this. If you're not using Shadow DOM, there are certain things you can't do in a constructor. For example, you're not allowed to look at the children, period. You do that and you're not going to get the results you think. You're not allowed to add or change or even investigate the attributes. There's a few other things that you can't do in a constructor, so you've got to understand that for the lifespan. And that matters, especially if you're trying to get something that's going to work in the various frameworks. In this particular example, I'm attaching Shadow DOM. If you do that, you can set its inner HTML, and that's totally fine, because technically Shadow DOM is not a child. It's kind of its own little thing off on the side. And then I've got an event listener for input, and all it does is it goes through, I'm looking at the top level, basically Shadow DOM for input, which will let me know when either one of these 2 input fields changes. And then I just use, if you look at these, I use the ID of name and age. From there, that gives me then the type. I do either name change or age change. And then I stick it into the appropriate internal variable by using that. I do all kinds of things to shortcut. I don't like having more event listeners than I need. And a lot of times, because if you're going to do Shadow DOM, you've got one place to listen to all events below it if you care to. If you don't, you can listen on the element and still do roughly the same thing. When things change, I dispatch a custom event, just so that this is to test and make sure I can use these in the other frameworks. When the attributes change, if it's age, I convert it to a number. Otherwise, I just save it off. And then I've got property getter and setters, and the same basic thing. I just make sure that they're, in this particular case, I default age out to a 0. I'll set them in here, including putting them into the shadow root. Now, having said that, what this does right here is this will end up calling the age setter, and this ends up calling the name setter. And so this stuff then gets put into the appropriate area of the component. The second component is a bar, a progress bar. A little simpler, but basically the same thing. I won't go through all the top stuff. The big difference here is that I've got a getter and setter for the percentage. The rest of it's pretty similar. And then I just do some validation to make sure it's good. And then again, all I do is right here is I just set the style width of an internal element so that it gives me the movement of the progress bar. So those are the two components that I'll be giving an example. Now, when I did this originally, I was hoping to do Ember, Vue, Backbone, React, Angular, and AngularJS. I couldn't figure out Backbone. If somebody has used Backbone and would like to help me, I'd love to figure out what I'm doing wrong on it, but I could not get Backbone to work. So, and that's too far. All right, so now on to the rest of the code examples. So first, I've got Angular here. So the idea, the whole premise to this talk is that you've taken time to write this really awesome component, and your company goes ahead and it changes what framework you're using, and you've just thrown out your code. And it's because we tend to write our components to match the framework that we're on. And what I'm trying to say is we don't need to. Let's match the components that we write to the browser spec and not to a framework spec. So in this particular case for Angular, I've got a simple app. Here's the internal components, right? I've got a title that will be filled out, the name and the age here. Now the idea here is that I want two-way binding, which you can't really do with a web component because Angular was designed to two-way bind with its own directives. But I'm emulating it. And so I just want to show that when I get this event, that it's going to go ahead and it's going to take the value and put it into the age variable, which then will get presented here as well. So it emulates two-way binding. In the status bar, it's the same type of thing. I've got it to where whatever the percent is, basically I've got the status bar and right next to it is a number. And so let me show you those. Oh, you're not supposed to see that. That's my cool thing. Okay, so the idea is these buttons, all they do is they actually change the percent variable. That's it. And Angular does what Angular does to pass that value into the web component, and then the web component does what it does. Now, what Angular is doing is, if you look at their code, they're basically saying, go take the value of the percent variable, convert it to a string, and stick it into this attribute. Which is why in this code, I have to do the attribute. I have to be looking for that attribute, and I have to support taking that value and converting it and using it inside of my code. And so that's all that Angular is doing, I'm increasing the value through an event off the button, and then the Angular will automatically adjust the stuff. But you'll notice this little UID right here. Angular is not swapping out my web component every time, it's just changing the value inside the attribute, which is what I wanted. These two guys, if I just change stuff in the name, and I don't know, is this, let's see. As I change things in the name here, you can see down here the quote, two-way binding is working. AngularJS, and I understand why they moved from what they did in JS to regular Angular, or to new Angular. They did everything, because they were doing everything off of attributes, they had to create directives to handle properties. And so what I had to create, and forgive me, I just got PRK done a while back, and my vision is so in and out right now. Oh, it's just down lower, that's right. So I created my main controller, which all it does is it's got the scope for the decrement and the increment, the set percentage, but I did have to create extra directives. And so what all these directives are doing is allowing me to tie into the property as opposed to the attribute. And in this particular case, it's the event. I needed to be able to listen to a specific event. And so basically what I'm doing is using Angular/jQuery's on, and I just listen for the particular keys. So the way the code works is I'm looking for, I take this stuff and I, let's see, sorry. On the element here, so it's a separate element, so I've got this main age change and main name change. Those are my directives, and that's what allows me to tie into providing a pseudo two-way binding, right? It allows me to actually get when that event triggers, and I call a function just like I would through regular two-way binding. I'm just saying, go do this, right? So that's Angular. Now, Angular has a little bit of a quirk to it that causes a bit of a problem on the attributes, sorry, on the, when you're setting a property. I like to go through, and if somebody sets a property to its default state, I like to get rid of my attribute. You can't do that with AngularJS, because what that does is that throws away the binding that you had created in your template, and all of a sudden the binding doesn't work at all. And so if you're going to use a web component in here and you change a value in your property, don't change the attribute. That's just a limitation to AngularJS. I didn't find that existing in any of the other languages. Okay, so the next is React. Same thing, right? In fact, the two web components are the exact same code. I'm just reusing them in each of these. And so sure enough, as I bump this up, and we get our number over here, or as I change these, then everything changes. So I'm still getting the approximation of two-way binding. I'm not a big React fan, and I am not a Redux fan. I don't like it, but I wanted to show that you can do this. Now, you want to throw Redux onto it if you want it. You'd want to definitely clean up this code. But the example this is, by the way, if you've ever had a problem with add event listener and remove event listener, write it like this. This blew me away when I wrote this the first time. You create a function which gives you scope. You do an add event listener. You return a function that does a call to the remove event listener, and it keeps the scope the same thing so that your callback is guaranteed to be the same thing. So even if you're using an anonymous inline function, it works. So this is one of the things that I love sharing, is these little tidbits that help out. So in React, I had to create a wrapper to go around the native web component. And in that, I just go ahead and I fill in the properties that I'm going to do. I've got the two functions that I can do that come in off of the buttons. But I need to do the component did mount for the two events that are not standard DOM events. And that just let me then go ahead and, I just go ahead and set the state and change the age or the name based upon the detail. And this is my call to the add event listener code, which produces the remove event listener function, and then I just call that and the component will unmount, as that cleans up my event listeners. The deck and inc are fine because they were just click events off a button, and React handles that right off naturally. And then in here, I'm just doing this .state for all of the properties. And for this one, you'll notice all I've got is the things that actually set the age and name. And I needed this, and maybe those of you who'd write React on a regular basis will understand this better. But basically, I needed to get a handle to this element so that I could set up the event listeners. And so I just set this .l1, which then gets used up here for the event listeners, right? Same component now being used in two different frameworks. The rest of this is pretty much the same thing. The next one is Vue. And again, I can increment and decrement this, and when I make changes to this, they automatically get done. So it's, again, emulating two-way binding. And what Vue is doing is pretty much the exact same thing. It's just their way. Here's your templates and like this. Now Vue does have a nice thing, so I like this about Vue. You can do a v-on : and then give it the name of the event. They'll handle any event. So kudos to Vue for understanding that and putting that in there. So this code is very clean because I didn't have to create anything funky for it to integrate with the framework. On this code, basically I just create, and again, I'm not an expert on any of these. So if the code looks ugly, throw peanuts at me or something. The incandec function, the set % function, all of it I just was able to do. The other functions were just handled right here in line because I didn't need to worry about them. But this is just the default values. It all works fine. So I liked Vue. Do you guys care about Ember? Does anybody care about Ember? Was that a yes or? Okay, we'll just skip Ember. Trust me, it works. Okay, this is Angular 2+. So same thing, it works. Now, I will say, Angular, I think, caught on with AngularJS. They caught on because they realized we shouldn't be dealing with attributes all the time. That's stupid. We should be dealing with the properties. And what that did, if anybody ever was around when Angular gave its presentation and talking about Angular 2 coming out and saying, we threw out, I think it was like 180 directives. Most of those were what allowed them to tie from an attribute into a property. And that's because for Angular, they deal with properties unless you explicitly tell it to be an attribute. And so I think they did a much better job on getting that set up. Let's see, right here. So in the code that uses it, again, it's still using the exact same web components. I go ahead and I set up an Angular-based component, set up the values I want, my increment and dec, and my set %, all of that can be done here. The HTML, so the bracket is basically saying, go put this in a property called age, don't stick it in the attribute called age. And then this is basically saying, when you get the event age change, call this, right? Vue is similar, so I think more and more that's happening, that people are saying, oh, no, we should be dealing with properties. React also, from the experience I had in getting all this stuff written, they're dealing more with properties than they are attributes, which is nice because attributes are strings. Properties are anything. And so there wasn't a lot of code to get the Angular code working. Okay. So this is a completely different component. And this is, what I wanted to show is this is the idea of being able to make something that you can use anywhere, right? I wanted something that gave me a %, but in a circular form, not using Canvas, not using SVG. And so this is actually a single DOM element. But as you can see, I can do my circles. And this will be up on the website if you guys want to play with it. The hardest part is the CSS and getting that figured out, and that is, so I had to do, sorry, here's the component. I had to build up quadrants, and that's because of the way I have my borders. But you can dig through the code, and I will document this before it goes up. So, having said all that, continue with this. So my suggestions, and before I left Family Search, which was, I spent 11 years there, I had a team, and I presented the ideas of how I felt we should do web components, and everybody got on board. And a couple of the people went off to other teams, and then we ended up pulling it back to our team, and the common feel from everybody on the team was, I like the way we do them. I don't like the way other people are doing it. Most of the other teams are using Polymer, but see, to me, Polymer is a no-win because it's still just a framework. You've got one more huge chunk of code that you got to download just to get your stupid web component to work when you don't need it because it's built in. So my suggestions are, know the rules, especially come to understand the constructor rule, right? And there's, if you go to the the W3C spec on web components, they've got about 6 bullet points that they talk about for the main things. And again, a lot of them are, you can't do anything with the children or attributes. Especially in the constructor. Like I said before, I use ES6 includes and then require for older browsers. I have 3 steps on this. Does it support import? Does it support class? And then no, it doesn't, right? And so this is your IE11 and then really, really old versions of browsers. This is not that long ago. For example, Chrome on Windows XP ended at version 48 or 49. I don't think they might have supported class. I don't remember. But I know they don't support import and a bunch of other things like that. And then import is basically all the newer browsers. Now I may have to make a 4th rule moving forward in the future as more and more features come in. But that's the way I break my code up. And then I've got special code that the very first time the browser goes to hit a web page, if my cookie isn't set, I send back to the browser saying, go figure out what the browser's capable of, redirect to the exact same page. Now that the cookie's set, I just continue on my merry way through the stuff. I've got that written in Node, but unfortunately my company currently owns it, so I'm rewriting it at home, and that will also be put up online. My preference is avoid Shadow DOM for now, unless your browsers support it. So if you're writing for Chrome, use it. If you're writing for Chrome and Safari, use it, right? But if you have to work all the way back to IE11, don't use it. It's not worth it at this point. And then if you aren't using Shadow DOM, then use namespace CSM like BEM. Take your choice. It doesn't matter, right? A lot of my CSS, you'll see right here, you know, this is very BEMified, right? I've got my round percent as my object, and then the cell is the sub component that I've got in there. But what this does is it gives you the advantage of guaranteeing never colliding in namespaces. Your CSS problems vanish, or at least they should, unless you've got 2 people trying to write the same thing. Yep, we did all these. Okay, that's what I've got. Are there any questions? I know we've got about 10 minutes left. That I can, okay, let me answer the first part of your question. Is there a library of web components others have made? Yes, there are about 3 or 4 of them. There's one that's just for Angular components, there's one that's for React components, there's one that's Polymer components, there's kind of one that's for native web components, but not really, not that I've seen anyway. That I can recommend, no. Dig around, you know. Here's the thing though. One of the big problems people have, and this is, I just read an article yesterday where somebody's saying, no, web components suck because if you use somebody else's web component, it's not going to match what our website looks like. Write it yourself. And it's like, well, okay, that's understandable. Now, my little spinner thingy, you know, you can change the foreground color, the background color, and everything else to it, how thick the bar is. If that fits your need, then use it, right? If it doesn't, then at least look at the component, find out what they're doing, and then convert it to be what you do need. Where'd my microphone go? Right here. Anybody else?
Is there any concept of CSS modules, native web components?
So the question is there any concept of CSS modules with native web components? If you use Shadow DOM, yes and no, because Shadow DOM will encapsulate the CSS that you put into it and not allow it to escape, and it doesn't allow outside stuff to get in, which is why it's also a problem. Now you can use CSS variables, which I use in a lot of this stuff, but CSS variables don't work all the way back to IE11. And so there are problems there. Now you can adjust that by doing properties or attributes on the component, and so you can get around it, but that's pretty much the best that I can offer you on that. How much time do I have left?
6.
6 minutes? Okay, another question? So with the hassle of CSS variables, should we move to Shadow DOM? Depends. I will tell you, I've got a chunk of code that I use in a lot of things, trying to remember which one it was in. Anyway, be aware with CSS. If you don't write your component in Shadow DOM, that doesn't mean you're not going to be in Shadow DOM. Okay? Because if your component gets used in somebody else's component and that one's Shadow DOM, you're in Shadow DOM. And if you try to put your CSS in the head, it won't work. You need to get it into theirs. And so I've got a function that will also be put up there. It's called setCSS, and all it does is checks, am I in somebody's Shadow DOM? Anybody's, my own, or am I inside of somebody's? If so, put the CSS there, and if not, put it in the head. And it guarantees no duplication. What it doesn't do is if I'm in this Shadow DOM and you move me to this Shadow DOM, it doesn't delete it from this one. But if you move it back, it's already there, so it won't put it back in. Anybody else? Thank you.